So as I'm in my third last week of my 12-week challenge, you may have heard me talk through this 12 weeks about disturbing thoughts, about anxious thoughts or memories that have been disturbing. And you may have taken it that there's some way of controlling that. Well, there's something called the default mode network. What is that? So my third last week of my 12-week challenge to show up every day and do my podcast. And so far, so good. Update on my other little challenge, which is to come up with an online course. I've been filming quite a few videos, so we're really going through that process as well. And I've got 3 weeks to complete that, and hopefully I will. So this mind that we have, what do we do with it? Because it's always getting in the way sometimes, right? So, well, not always, sometimes. It's sometimes getting in the way. And one of the ways it gets in the way is it's throwing out thoughts, throwing out memories, throwing out associations. And sometimes we get that feeling that our mind is just full of stuff, right? I think I spoke about it the other day. And I don't want to give the impression that that means there's something wrong with us. It's not. That's exactly what our minds do. It's called the default mode network. And the default mode network is kind of like a bit like a screensaver, if you like. It's when you're not actually paying attention to anything. Your mind kind of goes into that default mode and starts processing, if you like, and chucking out things and associating things. And it's kind of going through this kind of very busy sorting out, throwing up things session, and that can be quite disturbing sometimes. But what is important here to realize is that's the default mode, right? So if that's the default mode, how do we get out of that default mode and back into a more task-orientated mode in our brain? Well, today's book that we're going to use for that is called Inside the Moment by Kirk Strossel, Patricia Robinson, and Thomas Gustafsson. And they talk about, how to actually detach from that kind of default mode and get into a more engaged mode, if you like, with our minds, more task-orientated. And they talk about this quite extensively in the book. And one of the keys is to, and I quote from the book, to resist that knee-jerk urge to escape from or avoid contact with the actual experience that you're having in the present moment that has a unpleasant emotion or thought attached to it. So basically, in other words, we've got to try to resist getting hooked into that. So when our default mode starts off and it's coming up with all these kind of disturbing things, disturbing thoughts, emotions are kind of triggered off, we've got to be careful not to be hooked in and fall down that rabbit hole. So creating a little space and kind of identifying these hooks are really important. It's a bit like the clutch on a car. Just at that bite point, if you know how to drive a car with a clutch, then at that bite point, that's like the hook coming in from our mind to try and hook us down that rabbit hole. So we've got to be careful not to get hooked in. The second is that we try to stay kind of disengaged from these very emotional, charged thoughts. And they show up in our awareness. They can be very provocative, and there might even be a really disturbing memory, and it kind of creates that unpleasant physical sensation in our body, and of course these very heavy or sad or disturbing emotions that go along with that. So what we want to do is to be able to appraise that and ask ourselves, is this helpful to me right now? Is this adding to the kind of tasks that I want to do? Is this contributing or is it distracting? And once we appraise that, we can really kind of suggest, well, you can just imagine for a minute that your mind is in the room with you, right? Imagine for a minute if you're lying in bed and having these disturbing thoughts, that your mind is kind of lying next to you, or if you're in the house or the car, your mind is just having a conversation with you. And just imagine what it was like if it was somebody else talking to you. And you might say to them, you know what, that's quite nice, what you're saying, but I'm not going to take that on board. All right. So that's a kind of a disengagement. You can actually choose when you want to take on board what your mind's saying, and sometimes you might choose not to. And so it kind of frees up your attention, and then it can be applied to purposes that are more functionally in line with what you're wanting to do. So that's kind of what happens, and that's what I try to practice. And it's not an easy thing. It takes time when you feel that you're getting hooked in, to just kind of talk to your mind and say, you know what, I'm not going to go down that road today. Thanks very much. I'm not going to fight it or run away or distract myself. I'm just going to say to my mind, no, I've got things to get on with, and I'm going to do the tasks that are important to me. And sometimes I actually, just detach from that and say, let's come back to that later, maybe, mind, and I've got things to do right now, as if you were talking to somebody else. Hope that was useful for you. And we'll be back tomorrow.
Dov Benyaacov-Kurtzman has embarked on a 12-week daily live challenge to disseminate a mixture of knowledge, combining his hand-picked golden nuggets from his personal library together with his decades of experience and learning. He is doing this as a committed action to service his values of contributing and helping others, using himself as the subject of this exercise, despite his feelings of awkwardness, anxiousness, and shame, which usually forms a barrier of uncomfortableness within, holding him back from accomplishing his goals. Dov Benyaacov-Kurtzman is an accomplished psychotherapist and clinical social worker with many years of learning and experience. And yet his self-disclosure of his vulnerability and openness is to demonstrate the human condition that we all experience from time to time. Disclaimer: the contents of this podcast, such as text, graphics, images, and other material contained on the podcast, are for informational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your mental health professional or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding your condition. Never disregard professional advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard on this podcast.